Thanks to everyone who made it out to the fairgrounds this last Saturday. Our solar fair event this year we did in conjunction with Winnebago County Conservation's Earth Day Festival. Total, we had about 470 people in attendance, which was great. Um, so over that morning, we gave a version of this presentation here that I'm going to give today, which essentially covers the basics of solar and heat pumps. So it's about 20 minutes long, so listen along. So to start off with the basics of solar, generally speaking, we tell customers that before they consider solar, they should consider efficiency upgrades, because the upfront cost of efficiency measures and the payback period associated with those efficiency measures tend to be lower than the cost of solar. So for example, swapping out inefficient lighting, incandescent bulbs, CFL bulbs for LEDs, um, getting rid of any electric resistance heating you might have. So for example, baseboards, unit wall heaters, swapping those out for heat pumps. And especially when it comes to water heating, swapping out electric resistance water heaters for heat pump versions makes sense to do before you install solar. And overall, generally speaking, you want to make sure your building is as tight and as well insulated as possible, especially if you're using electric for your space heating, whether that be electric resistance heating or some form of a heat pump. So some of the concepts of solar, solar is kind of possible on an economic sense from the concept of what we call net metering. Net metering is essentially the ability to produce electricity at one point in time and receive credit for the power you're producing, which you're going to then draw down at a later point in time when you're not producing electricity. So in the overnight hours, on cloudy days, in the fall, in the winter months, you're able to essentially take that power that you exported onto the grid and that you received credit for, and then draw that credit back down. Net metering makes solar economical. So along with net metering, you have to size your solar appropriately. Um, so your solar system can't be sized greater than what your annual electric usage is. So essentially, you can't use your solar as a cash register. So you're only going to receive credit for the electricity you produce up to essentially what your historic electric use is. So you have to size your system appropriately. When we talk about sizing, people commonly get kind of hung up on this idea that you have to offset 100% of what your electric use is. That's not the case at all. So maybe you have budget limitations, you have space constraints, maybe you have shading limitations, which prohibit how much um, solar you're able to install. So if you're only able to offset, let's say 40% or 50% of what your electric use is, that's great. There's still going to be financial benefit to you, and there's going to be environmental benefit to doing that. So install what you can. Don't get hung up on this idea that you have to install 100% of what your usage is. Um, so when we look at a solar array, there are essentially three types of systems that we look at. The first is a grid-tied system. So with a grid-tied system, essentially what you have is solar panels that are connected right to your meter, so when those solar panels produce electricity, anything that you're using on site is going to be consumed right on site at that point of production. And then any excess production is going to be fed back out onto the grid, of which you're going to get credit for the power that you're producing, which is then going to potentially be fed back into your neighbor's house or wherever the closest path is. But a limitation with a grid tied system is that if the utility provider's electricity goes out, your power is going to go out. So if you want to incorporate resiliency into your system, you'd want to consider a grid tied system with a battery backup system. So the utility provider's power goes down, you're then able to maintain power. Given the fact that net metering rules are so favorable to customers here in Iowa, On an economic sense, battery backup systems don't make sense at all. Um, in other markets where they don't have favorable net metering rules, or potentially, in wildfire prone areas like California, where utilities are preemptively shutting off customers' power to prevent wildfires, battery backup systems absolutely make sense. In our market, they really don't make sense though. We commonly tell people that in the future, your EV is going to serve as your battery backup. The size of batteries that are going into modern EVs have the capability of powering your house for many, many days. So if you're all inclined to pursue battery backup, think about that in terms of what you could do with potentially an EV, not just a battery backup storage system that's contained, in your basement or in your garage. Finally, we have off-grid systems. They're becoming increasingly rare. They're expensive. They're complicated. They require you to curtail your usage. Essentially, anything you produce has to be stored on site in batteries. They're few and far between these days. Um, Solar siting basics. Generally speaking, we want panels to face south. Panels that face south are going to have the shortest payback period. So for Alliant Energy customers here in Iowa, um, your payback period under optimal situation where you have south-facing panels with minimal shading, you're going to have a system payback period of about 7 years. For my energy customers rates tend to be a little bit lower as a result. The value of the solar you're producing is a little bit lower. Your payback period is going to be about 10 years. And keep in mind, businesses and farms are potentially able to take advantage of depreciation, which is going to shorten that payback period even more. Um, Given the fact that solar has come down in cost to such a great extent, panels facing east and west are oftentimes now making sense economically. So instead of a 7-year payback, you might look at an 8-year or 9-year payback. Um, and even now, we're seeing panels that are being installed on shallow north-facing slopes. There was an array put in here in town just about a month ago, where they put 6 panels on a north-facing hipped roof garage. I ran the numbers on those panels, and they're looking at a production loss of about 35 to 40%. But if you run the numbers, you're still looking at a payback period of 13 to 14 years, which for some customers might make sense. Generally speaking, though, you want to have your panels facing south. You want to minimize any shading losses, and then panels on east and west facing slopes might make sense as well. Um, Different array types. The first type we have is a roof mount array. So roof mount arrays are going to be cheapest, which is going to result in the shortest payback period. They should be installed on structurally capable quality roofs, though. You're signing a 25-year contract with your utility provider. You want to make sure that the roof that you're putting those panels on lasts for 25 years. Um, so roof mount arrays tend to be cheapest. The next option is going to be a ground mount array. They tend to be more expensive. They're great for rural customers and those without space constraints. And finally, we have pole mount arrays. Generally speaking, they're going to be the most expensive. They're great for urban and rural customers where you have space constraints, or maybe you have a suboptimal roof, or you have shading issues. So these are the 3 types of panel setups you're going to encounter. Um, so if you look at a hypothetical cost analysis here in Decorah, let's say this is an Alliant customer. Let's say that this household uses 10,600 kilowatt hours of electricity a year, which is about average. If we want to offset their electric use 100% with solar, we're going to need a solar array that's 7.9 kilowatts in size. Keep in mind though that that's under optimal situation. So panels facing south without shading losses and at the right slope. So that 7.9 kilowatt solar array is going to produce about 10,600 kilowatts of electricity a year. So in our market with a roof mount array running about $2.20 a watt installed, we're looking at a total system cost of about $17,400. Um, this customer then would be eligible for a 30% federal tax credit, which would reduce the cost of the system to $12,200. If you look at the value of the electricity that's being produced by this system in our market with rates of about 17 cents a kilowatt hour, that means that the system is going to produce about $1,800 of electricity a year. And if you run the math on that, that payback period for this system is going to be about 7 years. So you're signing a 25-year contract with Alliant. You look at the total value of installing the system versus not installing the system over that 25-year period, you're going to be ahead about $30,000 over the course of 25 years. So solar definitely makes sense from an economic perspective. Getting into heat pumps to cover a few of the basics here. So heat pumps essentially transfer heat from one space to another. They're not actually producing heat. So there are two types of heat pumps. The first is a ground source system, which essentially uses the ground as a reservoir to extract energy from and draw energy to, depending on whether we're trying to heat or cool with that system. The second type of setup is an air source heat pump, which is going to essentially use the outside air as a thermal energy reservoir. So whether you're in heating mode or cooling mode, it's going to use a refrigerant and a compressor to either draw heat from the outside ambient air and draw that heat into the building, or when you're trying to cool the space, to take the heat that's in the building and extract that heat and bring it outside. So heat pumps can be used for both space heating and space cooling, in addition to water heating. Delivery methods of how you can incorporate a heat pump into an HVAC system. There are a million different ways you can do it. You can integrate it into ductwork. You could go ductless route where you've got either wall mounts, floor mounts. They make low static and mid static ducted units. They make ceiling cassette units, which fit into ceiling grid tiles. There are air to water heat pumps, which are going to provide a hydronic option. So, for example, water radiators, in-floor heat. There's lots of different variations of what heat pumps you can couple with. So generally speaking, why would you invest in a heat pump? The first point to note here is that you can couple your heat pump with solar to essentially phase out the use of gas for your space heating. This has always been possible, but it now makes sense on an economic perspective because the cost of solar has decreased so much. So if you were to oversize your solar system, you coupled then with net metering could take the excess production that you're producing and then use those credits for space heating with some form of a heat pump to provide then space heating for your house. So the cost of operation of an air source heat pump, generally speaking, for electric resistance customers is going to be about half to a third that. And for propane customers, the cost of operating an air source heat pump is going to be about 3/4 that of propane. So heat pumps definitely pay for themselves on an operational basis for electric resistance customers and often propane customers. If you look at the cost of operation of an air source heat pump versus natural gas, right now with the cost of gas being pretty high, they're about comparable. So that you're not going to see really an operational savings from switching from natural gas to an air source heat pump. But what it gives you is that ability to essentially not use fossil fuels for your space heating if you're able to then couple that with solar. Um, Another method we commonly talk about with heat pumps is a dual fuel option, where essentially what you're doing is you're coupling a fossil fuel furnace with a heat pump, and you're essentially setting them to work in conjunction with one another, such that the gas furnace is going to operate when it's economically advantageous to do so, and then the heat pump is going to operate when it's financially advantageous to do so. So keep in mind with an air source heat pump, your efficiency is going to be relative to what the outside temperature is. So in a dual fuel setup, essentially what you're doing is you're going to tell the system, okay, below, let's say 10 degrees, we know that it's going to be more cost advantageous to run that gas furnace than it is to run the heat pump. And anything above 10 degrees, we know it's going to be cheaper to run that heat pump. So combined with a smart thermostat, we set that system up so that the two operate in conjunction with one another. Oftentimes, this type of setup can kind of be your lowest foot in the door into a heat pump. So with a dual fuel setup, oftentimes you're able to retain your existing furnace. And essentially what you do would be to swap out your AC condensing unit, so the outside unit of your air conditioner, swap that out for a heat pump, and then swap out the coil that sits on top of the furnace. So dual fuel options are promising for customers. And one thing to finally note on here is that although with a heat pump, you're using electricity and you're not actually burning fossil fuel at the point of where you're producing that heat or cooling. But note that some electricity that the grid is providing you is going to be dirty. So if you look at the grid in Iowa right now, we're at about 55 to 60% renewable. Every year that's growing and growing. But even though you're not using fossil fuels to run your heat pump, you are still going to be using some amount of fossil fuels to provide that electricity to you. Oftentimes people also talk about like the concept of net zero, meaning that if I, oversize my solar to a certain degree, I can then cover what it takes to heat my house using then a heat pump. But keep in mind that the grid mix might be different. So you're going to produce all that electricity in the summer months, when there may be a whole bunch of renewables on the grid, and then draw down that credit in the winter months when the grid might not be as clean. So just because you may have a one-to-one offset doesn't mean that you're essentially, negating um, your environmental use. So those are a few concepts you might want to take into account with a heat pump, but generally speaking, heat pumps are kind of the path forward to a carbon-free future for space heating. So if you look at the efficiencies of these different setups here, we commonly compare them to electric resistance. So we say that electric resistance is going to be 100% efficient. What that means is that I essentially consume 1 unit of electricity, and that consuming the 1 unit of electricity is going to produce 1 unit of heat. With a heat pump, since we're not actually producing heat, we're simply moving heat from one location to another, we're able to maximize that efficiency. So with a ground source heat pump, we're using the ground as a reservoir. And since the ground stays relatively constant temperature throughout the year, we're able to get a relatively constant efficiency of that heat pump over the course of the whole year. So we can say with a ground source system, we're able to achieve an efficiency of 350 to 450%, meaning so I use 1 unit of electricity on the front side, I'm going to get 3.5 or 4.5 units of heat or cooling back from that system. Now, ground source systems tend to be really expensive. Historically, in cold climates, ground source systems have made a ton of sense. But the exciting part here is kind of the advancements that have been made around air source systems. So both the efficiency of air source systems have improved greatly, and the output of air source systems have increased greatly at cold temperatures. So keep in mind the efficiency of an air source heat pump varies depending on what the outside temperature is. If it's 15 below zero outside, I'm only able to extract a certain amount of heat from that outside air. It's harder. I'm not able to extract as much, as many BTUs from that outside air. But over the last 10 years or so, the technology around air source heat pumps has grown by leaps and bounds, making them like viable, suitable solutions for cold climates. So if you look at the seasonally adjusted efficiency of an air source heat pump in our climate, um, On some of the new high efficiency stuff, we're looking at seasonal efficiencies of 250 to 300% relative to electric resistance. And if you look at the cost of install of these systems, they're about a third that of ground source systems. Um, so increasingly, air source heat pumps are kind of supplanting the market dominance that ground source systems traditionally have had because they've advanced tremendously over the last decade. Um, Moving on to water heating, we commonly tell people that your water heating might kind of be your foot in the door, like dual fuel setups, to heat pumps. So essentially with a hybrid heat pump water heater, what we have is an electric resistance element coupled with an air source heat pump. Heat pump water heaters, they have to be installed in conditioned or semi-conditioned living spaces. So if you look at the illustration here, essentially on the bottom of the unit, we have the tank of the water heater. Sitting above that, then we have the air source heat pump. So with a hybrid heat pump water heater, it's a contained unit where the heat pump sits within the living space, unlike heat pumps for space heating, where there's split systems, where the condensing unit and the compressor is sitting outside and the evaporator coil is sitting inside. Um, with a hybrid heat pump water heater, since that heat pump is sitting in the living space, we're able to kind of maximize the efficiency of it. So the efficiency of this type of setup is going to be like 300 or 350% versus electric resistance water heaters, meaning that if you swap from an electric resistance water heater to a heat pump water heater, you're going to save like $400 to $500 a year. Um, with that type of setup, then when you take advantage of the federal tax credit of 30% coupled with your potential utility rebate, you're looking at a payback period that's as short as 3 years. And when you account for those incentives, both the tax credits and the utility rebates, you're looking at a total install cost that's roughly equivalent to a conventional gas water heater. The actual equipment cost of a heat pump version is going to be, $700 or $800 more than a gas version. But when you take into account the tax credit, the utility rebate, you're looking at a total all-in cost that's about the same. So generally speaking, we say for natural gas customers or propane customers, you might consider a heat pump version, even if your equipment is not at the end of its useful life. There's going to be some amount of cost savings in the operation of the equipment. And for those customers who are currently using electric resistance for their water heater, we recommend switching to a heat pump version now, even if your electric resistance water heater still has some useful life in it. Um, and then at the energy fair, we had a table that had fact sheets of all the different incentives that are available through the climate bill that was passed this last fall. If you would like to look at those fact sheets, you can go on our website, energydistrict.org. You'll find all of them there. But essentially, to kind of recap what those are and what we talked about here, we've got a 30% federal tax credit for solar, geothermal, battery storage. The nice part about that federal tax credit is that if you don't have tax liability within a given year, you can carry that credit forward. The other new federal tax credit is a 30% credit for energy efficiency measures like heat pumps, both for space heating, water heating, windows, exterior doors, insulation, electrical panel upgrades. That tax credit has a maximum yearly cap of $3,200. And unfortunately, you have to have the tax liability within the year the efficiency measures were implemented. So if you have, let's say, $1,500 that you're eligible for on the tax credit, you have to have tax liability of $1,500 within that given year. Otherwise, you're going to lose the value of it. You can't carry it forward like you can the tax credit for solar, geothermal, and battery storage. Um, and then very briefly, there's going to be two rebate programs which come into effect. One of them is for electrification, so heat pumps for space heating, heat pumps for water heating, electrical panel upgrades, heat pump clothes dryers, electric induction stoves. That program is going to pay potentially up to $14,000 to households for electrification activities. And then the second one is a performance-based rebate. It's electrification agnostic, meaning that so long as you meet the benchmark requirements of the program. So if I were to reduce my energy consumption by whatever the threshold is of the program, so let's say I have an old furnace, I upgrade to a new high efficiency furnace, it reduces my energy consumption by 20%. I then might be eligible for money through this rebate program since I've lowered my overall energy usage. So both of the rebate programs are going to come into effect sometime the first part of 2024. You go on our website, you'll find a lot more information on what those look like. Keep in mind, you're going to have to wait until those programs come into effect before you're able to take advantage of them. So anything you do now is not going to be eligible for the two rebate programs. And then finally on here, we've got the new EV tax credit for better or worse. They're more complicated. There's a lot of new qualifying rules for them. So essentially, there's a new $7,500 rebate for new vehicles and a $4,000 rebate for used vehicles. Again, our website, energydistrict.org, has all the fact sheets on there of the rebate programs. But thank you for listening. Hope to catch you next year at our solar fair. Thank you.